at the, okay. This meeting is being recorded. All right, so anyway, I was talking about Descartes and how he found that he could doubt his sensory knowledge, that he knew that his experience of the world was not something that he could be absolutely certain about, partly because he knew that it was very much like his dream state, and he knew that that was an illusion. So he had various ways of doubting that, and then this raised a question for philosophers: how do we know that there is anything external to our subjective experience of things? What happens in our mind? How can we know that? This became a problem that philosophers thought about, trying to arrive at some kind of certainty that there's an external world that corresponds to an objective world that corresponds to our the perceptions in our minds. Well, one philosopher who was an Irish Anglican bishop, his name was George Berkeley. The city of George Berkeley, actually the pronunciation, but the city of Berkeley, California was named after this particular philosopher, which is kind of unusual. In any case, the conclusion he arrived at was not only that we cannot know that there's anything external, but in fact, there is nothing external to mind, that everything is in mind. And he, being Irish, he was more familiar with arguments from English philosophy, and he looked at the philosophy of John Locke. We talked a little bit about him. And Locke was the one who said that objects have primary and secondary qualities. The primary qualities are things like form, motion, weight, things like that. He said those are primary qualities. Those are in the objects themselves, right? And he said, and then there are secondary qualities, which are a result of our perceiving them. So the color of a thing, the taste of a thing, the sound of a thing, all of those are a result of the interaction of our minds with the external material world. That was Locke's view. So primary, secondary qualities. But Berkeley looked at that and he said, wait a minute, the things that you're calling primary qualities, shape, motion, that sort of thing, we only know that from our minds too. It's not a different case. There's not two different kinds of experiences. There's just the one kind of experience. We experience these things in our minds. These are ideas in our minds, just as things that we think are ideas in our minds that are based on these other ideas. So he concluded that there was, based on our experience, based on our our perceptions, there's no reason whatsoever to infer that there's something unlike ideas in the world. They're only ideas. Okay. So now we get a metaphysics that's very much like the metaphysics that Unity teaches. Berkeley made a very detailed, rational argument to make this point, which I'm really just summarizing. But the point is that the Unity's metaphysics really corresponds to what this Irish Anglican bishop argued back in the 18th century. And he famously said, to be is to be perceived. S-A-S percipi in Latin. To be is to be perceived. That something would not, if something is not and cannot be perceived, then it doesn't exist. So all that we perceive, all that there is, are ideas in mind. And he also concluded that we do not will all of these ideas into existence. Some of them are there, that we have. There are some things that we do will into existence, the things that we do and so on. If you're a painter, you sort of will that into existence. Those ideas. If you're a musician, same thing, and so on. Or anything that we might do. Those are things that are a result of our will. When we travel, that's a result of our will, and so on. But there are other things that aren't. And so he concluded that, therefore, there must be a greater mind, a universal mind, that wills those things into existence, that has those ideas, that perceives those ideas, the ones that we do not will into experience. And so that was his case for the existence of God. God as a universal mind. All right, so there's nothing here that's fundamentally different from what Charles Fillmore taught as far as the nature of reality goes. All perceptions are perpetually in a universal mind, the mind of God. So this, as I said, he made a fairly elaborate and very strong argument. He was another one of these. There's another one of these philosophers who was also a mathematician, but he was also a theologian. Obviously, he's a bishop, right? So he made, as I say, made a pretty strong case. So that was disturbing to other philosophers. They weren't quite ready to give up on an external world, but they recognized the truth of what he was saying as far as our knowledge goes. We don't know anything outside of our own minds. And as Berkeley was saying, there isn't anything outside of mind. Well, we might say there are ideas of a universal mind, and then there are our ideas of that. Right. So what do you do if you look at Berkeley's argument and say, well, he's right. That's where all our experience is. It's in our minds. How do you get an external world back? Because people are very reluctant to give up an idea of a world of matter that they are perceiving, that seems to them that they're perceiving. Okay. So a Scottish philosopher named David Hume looked at Berkeley's argument, and he said there's two types of perceptions. There are the perceptions that we can call ideas that are in our minds, and then there are what he called impressions. So impressions he described as forceful and vivacious, and those must be from an external world that is beyond our internal sort of mental states. So he made this distinction. This is how he's tried to get around what Berkeley was saying. There's two kinds of perceptions that we have. There are the ideas, which are faint images, and then there are these forceful impressions that are the basis of our other kinds of ideas, our fainter ideas. Okay. So that's the way he made a distinction. Of course, the fact that we have the two types of impressions doesn't really get back the external world, and he recognized that, but he said, okay, but it's reasonable to infer that these more forceful impressions, being of a different type, aren't really the ideas that Berkeley said they were. He said therefore there must be an external world, right, that causes the sensory impressions, though, an external world that causes these forceful and vivacious sensations, as he put it. And if he had stopped there, that would have been a pretty strong argument, I guess. At least it sort of brings back an idea, well, maybe we don't know exactly what the external world is, but we know it's out there, right? Because it makes these impressions, it causes us to have these impressions. And it would have been fine, except then he went into examining the nature of cause. And in his examination of the idea of cause and effect, he concluded that there wasn't any sort of necessary law of cause and effect. There's just these different impressions where we have certain kinds of impressions conjoined with other impressions later, and so we came up with the idea of cause and effect from that, but there's really no such thing as a law of cause and effect, right? Just habitual conjunction of impressions, not logically necessary. Okay. Well, see, now that's exactly where he sort of undermined his previous argument. Because if there really isn't such a thing as a logically necessary law of cause and effect, then you can't really say that there's an external world that causes our vivacious impressions. So he's sort of stuck right back where we were before, right? We just have these impressions of events. And we see that certain kinds of events always seem to follow other kinds of events, right? From anything from noticing that as the world turns, we see the sun in the morning, and then it goes away at night, or sunrise and sunset, right? So we recognize, okay, that happens. We see what Newton called the laws of motion. We see that those happen in a very predictable way. Okay, but he's basically denying that we can call that's a law. He's just saying, well, as it happens, those things habitually follow one after the other. So Hume, I don't know, I mean, some people would say that he refuted, but this argument refutes Berkeley, but it kind of really doesn't. You know, it's just kind of, it sort of recognizes a distinction in types of perceptions we have in mind, but it doesn't really prove that there's an external world of made up of matter that exists independently of mind. So Bertrand Russell, who's a great admirer of David Hume, said that because of his idea of cause and effect, because of Hume's idea of cause and effect, he really should have just been a solipsist, right? Somebody who just thinks all that exists is the content of his own mind. So Russell was not convinced by Hume as much as he admired his philosophy and his arguments in other respects. Hume made a lot of the ideas of making a case by as a matter of what's probable, and so one of the things that he looked at were miracles in the Bible, and he just basically, asked the question, which is more probable, that these unnatural, supernatural miracles occurred, or that a human being just lied and made the story up? He said, since we know that human beings do in fact lie and make stories up, that seems more probable than that there was a supernatural intervention, such as stopping the sun during the Battle of Jericho, and it's talked about in the Bible. Anyway, so Hume sort of critiqued some of the ideas that people had about miracles on this basis, which is another thing that was important to theologians, maybe not so much to important for theologians to try to come up with a counter argument, not so much for philosophers. Philosophers don't really concern themselves much with stories of miracles. That's not their usual wheelhouse of things they like to think about. Okay, so that's Hume anyway. And some people, as I said, some people found his argument impressive and others did not. One person who's very famous, that I'm sure you would have heard of, who was impressed very much by Hume's argument, was Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher. He said Hume awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. And so Kant's approach to trying to understand reality, nature of reality, was to start just where Berkeley started and just where Hume started, which is, okay, we have these, what we work with are our experiences. We might say the content of our minds, if you will. That's our direct knowledge. That's the only direct knowledge we have, is what happens, our experience of it, right? And so he accepted Hume's idea that there must be something external, an external world that causes what we call our sensations, our impressions, right? But Kant also thought, well, now there's another kind of thing that happens in mind. It has to do with the way mind works, the way our minds are structured to work. We cannot know that our minds are our brain, because that would be knowing the thing in itself. And this is the thing he denied. We can't know the thing in itself, but there are things that we can know, right? So he says in our minds, we have what he called a priori categories, or in simpler language, in simpler English, intuitions. We have intuitions. Our mind operates by what he calls these intuitions. And so our experience is shaped by these intuitions in certain ways, right? For example, we will always perceive things as taking place in time and in space. That's fundamental. So his point was, even though we cannot know that there is external time and external space as we ordinarily conceive it, what we can know is we will always experience things that way. No matter what the world is in and of itself, we will always experience it because of the way our minds work. Our minds actually structure experience, so things will always occur in a sequence of time, and it will always occur in a context of space and distance. We will always think of, it's built into the way we think, we will always make distinctions like between unity and plurality. right? We will always think on terms of cause and effect because that's built into the way we perceive things. And we will not just think of things that way, but we will always experience things that way. So our minds shape our experience of the external world in certain ways. And because that's so, part of what he was trying to do was firm up a metaphysical foundation, if you will, for science. Because that's so, because we always will perceive things in terms of space and time and cause and effect and these other categories, we can therefore draw conclusions from our impressions or our perceptions, the way, which is what science does, right? It observes stuff and then how things happen, and then it sort of creates these equations or these statistics or whatever to in order to predict events. So he wanted to make science possible, even though he recognized that you really couldn't say for certain what the external world might be like. We can only know it as we experience it, and our experience is shaped by these built-in categories, if you will. Okay, I'm going to stop here for a second and see if you're still following me. I've tried to explain this as simply as possible, but Kant is extremely complex, and I'm not even sure all the time that I understand him, but I'm pretty sure what I've said so far is right. So are you kind of all with me on that? You get what he's saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I think it's an interesting, it's certainly an interesting theory that, and it makes a certain amount of sense that our minds function in certain ways all the time, including, we will perceive things in terms of space and time and the other categories. So Kant's philosophy was in many ways more influential than Hume's in the sense that he went into much more detail, and it was just more compelling to subsequent philosophers. So there's still a lot of philosophers who think that Hume and Kant basically had things right. Okay, but to me, it's like, but you're all sort of admitting, if you take Kant or if you take Hume, you're all basically admitting that you really can't get outside of mind. You can't really say there's anything external to mind. That Berkeley's argument also holds up as it happens, right? But there's some things in the so you don't have Berkeley didn't have so many defenders because people are really reluctant to deny that there's a material world, including philosophers. But when you kind of get right down to it, these arguments maybe refined our ideas of the nature of mind, but they never really got around what Berkeley was saying. At least that seems to be the case to me, which is why I can be a unity metaphysician and not a Kantian, for example. Right? The other thing you might have heard of from Kant, by the way, is the categorical imperative. Probably heard that phrase, and that's another idea that he had, that what he called practical reason, that our ideas of morality are also built in to the way our minds work, just like the ideas of cause and effect and space and time are built into the way we perceive things. It's also the case that we have this what he calls a categorical imperative. But in simplest possible terms, the categorical imperative is basically just another version of the golden rule. Okay, it's stated in his, sort of derived from his philosophical argument, but that's kind of what it boils down to. Don't do things to others that you would not want done to yourself. Is basically it. And he basically argued that's built into the way we perceive things, and that also, if I can take it just one step further, that our moral ideas combined with our ideas of cause and effect tend to make us believe that the universe must in some way be just, that people must experience the consequences of their actions for good or bad, and that therefore, since we don't always experience the consequences in this life, there must be an afterlife. So he kind of constructed an argument for the existence of an afterlife based on the categorical imperative. So it's pretty, I don't necessarily recommend reading German philosophers. For one thing, their sentences tend to run on for pages at a time. So they can be pretty complicated, but they certainly did have some very interesting ideas. Now, one other idea from Kant is what he called antinomies. And antinomies, again, sort of a fancy word for um, contradictory ideas of a certain type, metaphysical ideas, as he would call them. So, simple example, some people argue that the universe has always existed and always will exist. And other people argue that the universe had a beginning and it will have an end. And Kant said you cannot decide between those two propositions. They're just sort of inherent, they're inherently undecidable. And so he thought it was a waste of time to try to decide them, right? So he talked about that. Well, and the reason I bring that up is that leads us to our next philosopher, who is George W F Hegel. You probably also heard of Hegel, right? So Hegel was inspired especially by Kant's idea of antinomies, but he drew a kind of a different conclusion, or he got a different idea from that. He said the history of, when he looked at the history of ideas and history in general, he saw in it a dialectic where someone would propose a theory or a thesis or hypothesis, and then someone else would come along with the opposite of that, the counterpoint. But instead of just ending there, what would happen, according to Hegel, is that a new idea would emerge that would kind of draw upon the two previous ideas, but come up with a new thesis. So this is usually characterized as a process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So you have an idea, then you have the opposite idea. Somehow a third idea emerges that assimilates both of the ideas, part of those ideas, but also cancels part of them. So he saw all of history, and he just sort of lays out what he means by that. All of history is the history of ideas as these opposing ideas, bringing up a new idea, which then becomes a new hypothesis, which then has its new counter hypothesis, which then ultimately results in a third, the synthesis. And so Hegel focused a lot on war because he saw wars as sort of the combat of these opposing ideas. And then whoever won the war, out of that war came sort of actually a new perspective on the world. So that, roughly was his notion of metaphysical dialectic or logic. And he also looked at consciousness sort of, so that's part of that's historical, but also part of it's metaphysical. He applied the same sort of dialectic to consciousness, the phenomenology of spirit, or the phenomenology of mind, or the phenomenology of consciousness, or the various English titles given to this work he wrote in German. And in his writing, he ultimately applies the idea of dialectic to phenomenology of consciousness, and comes to a conclusion that nothing is completely real but the whole, the absolute, which is itself spiritual. So what's completely real is the self-consciousness of the whole. So he goes back in a way to Berkeley's idea of a universal mind, but from another direction. And so he sees the whole as a complex system, like an organism, and that each of the parts have degrees of reality in terms of their relationship to the aspect of the whole. So only the whole is completely real, but the parts, which of course would include us as individuals, we have reality to the extent that we participate in the whole, that we have some part to play, if you will, in the whole. So this is also an idealist philosophy, because ultimately what's real is not matter, but mind, and that the whole history of the universe is, according to him, the absolute becoming self-conscious through this process of the Hegelian dialectic. Okay, so those are some of the responses to Berkeley and to this puzzle of materiality. And what you can see is that there are those who contend that there is that the world is material, but they also have to recognize that we cannot know that for sure, that in effect, it's a hypothesis. And then there are others who say, look, all we really know is mind, and all that can really be known is mind, and all that really is mind. So Berkeley and Hegel kind of arrive at the same basic perspective from somewhat different angles in this system. So that's kind of where we are. in the middle of like the 19th century, right? That's where metaphysics comes up to. And so this is where we get into the discussion, okay? So you've studied unity, so you're aware of this idea that of mind as the reality, but you're not only just aware of the idea, but you have engaged in various practices that are based on that idea. The use of affirmations, that affirmations do something, or visualization does something, or the different methods we apply does something in our world, has an effect on our world, that we are capable of changing the world by changing our thoughts, changing our lives by changing our thoughts. You're all very familiar and comfortable with that, right? So then
Yes.
to the question then for discussion is just to kind of share some of that, but also sort of think about and talk about, do you consider this philosophical idea, that the case that Berkeley makes for the mind, do you consider it as plausible, probable, unlikely? Do you think that there is an external world, that the other philosophers that hold to that position are right, even if we're not exactly sure how mind interacts with that? So that's the kind of thing, is just sort of discuss the metaphysics of it. What is your take on the external world, the relationship between the external world and our experience of it and mind, and then bring into that conversation, how, to what extent do you think your thoughts experience your world based on your experience? What extent do your thoughts affect your world? Okay, so that's what I'd like us to discuss in our breakout groups. So, any questions about what I'm asking you to discuss?
No.
Okay, so just sharing, your experience with working with thoughts, and then sort of branching out from that, in terms of the nature of reality. Do you find the pure mind idea more sensible, or do you find something like maybe Kant or Hume, the idea of there's a world out there we just can't know it directly? That's kind of what their position is in a nutshell. So I'm going to put us into groups, breakout rooms, and give you some time to just share about that and what you think about it. Let's see, how many folks we got here? 10, this is 8. So let's see if I do. Let's do 3 rooms. I think that'll work. So we got, just double check, 10 minus 2 is 8, 3 rooms. I could do 4 rooms, can't I? Yeah, I'll do 4, okay. You'd think I'd be better at math than I am, but okay. So if everybody's ready, off we go. You'll have one other person to discuss it with, so you both get a chance to sort of share, and then we'll come back in a little while. So we'll go about 10 minutes. Here we go. It's going to take a second for you to get beamed into your rooms, so hang on. Okay.